Real strength is when you could fight back, but choose to master yourself instead. Victory isn't always louder. Sometimes it's just quieter than your ego can hear.
Every pause becomes a moment of silence. Every choice to not fight back makes you stronger than the person trying to provoke you. You don't conquer your enemies by shouting louder. You conquer them by showing they can't control you. When Rosa Parks was arrested in December 1955 for refusing to give up her bus seat, the NAACP chose King to lead. The Montgomery bus boycott wasn't just a protest, it was strategic warfare. Instead of meeting violence with violence, King chose economic warfare. For 381 days, the black community refused to ride the buses, crippling the transit system financially. The enemy expected riots they could crush with force. Instead, they faced empty buses and moral superiority they couldn't defeat. King understood that his real enemy was bus drivers, or even the city officials. It was the system of segregation itself, and systems aren't defeated by bullets. They're defeated by exposing their fundamental weakness, the need for cooperation from those they oppress. On December 20th, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled segregated buses unconstitutional. King had won his first major victory without firing a single shot. But when it looked all good, the explosion shattered the quiet evening like thunder. Windows rattled, and the front porch of 309 South Jackson Street crumbled under the force of the dynamite blast. Inside, Coretta King had been sitting in the living room with Mrs. Mary Luce Williams when they heard the thud on the front porch. Seconds later, the world erupted. Baby Yolanda slept peacefully in the back bedroom, miraculously unharmed. But outside, something far more dangerous than dynamite was building. Within minutes, they came. First dozens, then hundreds. Black men and women from across Montgomery, drawn by the news that spread like wildfire. They bombed Reverend King's house. By the time the fire trucks arrived, nearly 500 people had gathered in the street, their faces hard with rage that had been building for months. They came armed. Shotguns, pistols, knives, baseball bats, shovels, pitchforks, anything that could serve as a weapon. The crowd pressed closer to the house, their anger a palpable force in the cool night air. Some shouted for revenge. Others demanded they march on the white neighborhoods. The tension was electric, dangerous, ready to explode into the kind of violence that would give the segregationists exactly what they wanted. "Where's the preacher?" Someone called out. "When he gets here, we'll show these crackers what happens when you mess with our people." The police had arrived too, but they were vastly outnumbered. The mayor and police commissioners stood nervously at the edge of the crowd, knowing that one wrong move, one spark, could ignite a race war that would consume Montgomery. Then, through the crowd, came Martin Luther King Jr. He had been at a church meeting when word reached him about the bombing. The drive home was the longest of his life, not knowing if his wife and baby daughter were alive or dead, not knowing what he would find when he arrived. When he saw his family was safe, relief flooded through him. But when he looked out at the crowd, he faced a choice that would define not just his leadership, but the entire future of the civil rights movement. Here were his people, ready to fight, ready to answer violence with violence, ready to give him the army he could use to strike back at those who had tried to kill his family. The crowd parted as he approached, their eyes filled with expectation, waiting for their leader to unleash their fury. King looked out at the sea of angry faces, at the weapons glinting in the street, at the raw power of 500 people ready to follow him into battle. In that moment, he held the fate of Montgomery, perhaps the entire South, in his hands. Martin Luther King Jr. raised his hand. The crowd fell silent, not gradually, not slowly, but instantly, as if he had cast a spell. 500 angry people, armed and ready for war, went completely quiet. When he spoke, his voice carried across the night air with quiet authority. "My wife and baby are all right. I want you to go home and put down your weapons. We cannot solve this problem through retaliatory violence. We must meet violence with non-violence. Remember the words of Jesus. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't what they had come to hear. King continued, his voice growing stronger. "We must love our white brothers no matter what they do to us. We must make them know that we love them." Jesus still cries out in words that echo across the centuries. "Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Pray for them that despitefully use you." The weapons began to lower. The tension in the air shifted from anger to something else. Confusion, perhaps, or maybe the beginning of understanding. "If you have weapons, take them home," King said firmly. "If you do not have them, please do not seek to get them. We are not advocating violence. We want to love our enemies. Be good to them. Love them and let them know you love them." One by one, then in groups, the crowd began to disperse. The shotguns disappeared under coats. The knives went back into pockets. The baseball bats were shouldered and carried home. Within an hour, the street was empty except for the police and fire officials, who watched in amazement as 500 armed and angry people simply went home. The mayor turned to the police commissioner in disbelief. "Did you see that? That young preacher stopped a riot with just his words." But King had done more than stop a riot. In that moment, he had conquered his enemy without fighting. The segregationists who had bombed his house had hoped to provoke exactly the kind of violent response they had witnessed. They wanted black people to riot, to loot, to burn, because then they could justify massive retaliation. They could call in the National Guard, impose martial law, and crush the bus boycott under the banner of maintaining order. Instead, King had turned their own weapon against them. By refusing to fight, he had exposed their violence as senseless brutality. By choosing love over hatred, he had claimed the moral high ground that would prove unassailable. By subduing his own people's anger, he had subdued his enemy's strategy the next morning. Newspapers across the country carried the story, but it wasn't the story the bombers had hoped for. Instead of headlines about race riots in Montgomery, the papers told of a young minister who had prevented violence with a simple call for love and understanding. The white community of Montgomery, many of whom had been secretly uncomfortable with the bombing, were forced to confront the contrast between the violence of the bombers and the dignity of the victims. Moderate whites began to question whether they were on the right side of history. The black community, meanwhile, saw in their young leader something unprecedented. Not just courage, but a new kind of power. The power to transform enemies rather than destroy them. The power to win through moral force rather than physical strength. The lesson that night on South Jackson Street, Martin Luther King Jr. proved that the ancient wisdom was true. The supreme excellence consists in subduing the enemy without fighting. He had faced his greatest test and emerged victorious, not by conquering his enemies, but by conquering himself and his followers. The bombers had failed completely. They had hoped to provoke a race war that would justify crushing the civil rights movement. Instead, they had created a moment that revealed the moral bankruptcy of segregation and the spiritual strength of those who opposed it. In years to come, King would face dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham, brutal beatings in Selma, and hatred wherever he went. But he would always remember that night in Montgomery when he learned that the greatest victories are won not with weapons, but with the strength to put them down. The enemy had been subdued without a single shot being fired. And in that victory, the civil rights movement found its true power, not in the ability to destroy, but in the courage to transform. That night, King would later reflect, "I learned that nonviolence is not a sign of weakness, but the highest form of strength. When we refuse to fight, we do not surrender, we conquer." Your challenge: 1. Pick one moment today when you feel irritated, insulted, or emotionally triggered. Someone cuts you off in traffic, a rude coworker, or a harsh comment online. 2. Before reacting, set a 5-second timer in your mind. Breathe once, slowly. Say silently, "Greater than power is not in the reaction." 3. Then, choose your response consciously. Not for revenge, but for growth. Stay calm. Respond with logic, grace, or silence. Watch what happens to them and to you. Why it works. This simple act rewires your brain for nonviolent power. Now comment down below what topics you want to choose to make a video on. See you on another video, guys.